Okay, yes, we'll start with our first question. Thank you.
Hi, a very good presentation. I have a quick question. So I think the message I got from your presentation is that now we're focusing more Canadian-grown nutrients and crops and try to integrate that much more into our dietary guideline. What do you think about the impact of climate change? Would that has any impact about in terms of what we can recommend and what type of crops we can promote?
Yeah. Is this on?
It's on. Yes.
Okay. That's really an excellent question. We didn't get a chance to get into the sustainability and the climate change. To me, that emphasizes even more the need for agriculture and health to be communicating, because crops will need to change. We can have a chance for innovative crops. You know, you can grow almonds or nuts in Ontario. It's not a viable crop yet, but things are changing. I mean, our wines, and as you go north, as the U.S. starts to dry out and runs out of water, there's lots of opportunities. There's also what we're abandoning, and I showed that diagram where, resources need to be developed for our Aboriginal communities in the north. You gain the Mediterranean diet certainly doesn't fit there, but there are foods that need to be developed and probably have greater climate adaptation that we're not using. And so we have to start thinking outside our traditional crops. I mean, I know I was just talking about traditional crops. You also have to think outside of traditional crops rather than import a lot of the crops that like the Chinese cabbage, whatever. You can grow that in Ontario, and it's growing well. So again, you don't have the transfer. You can make good use of agricultural land in Canada for a tremendous variety of crops, and that adapts to the climate change question.
Thank you.
We have to do more with it.
Maybe a follow-up for Isabel. Do your respondents integrate the question of climate change with respect to the food system? Do you see, does your survey ask that question, or how do your respondents?
Sorry, we actually haven't specifically asked the question about climate change, but we've asked the question about locally grown, and globally. So consumers are very split when it comes to that. So a lot of them do, especially the younger consumers, are more into global, and the older consumers, we see that they support more the local movement.
Thank you. Leah, yes.
I have a question. I'd taken a reply from any of the presenters today. We've heard a lot of knowledge generation, even with respect to review of the current Canadian Community Health Survey. We heard about knowledge generation and the work you're doing, David. And then Harvey, your last comment was, oh, maybe we should explore how we can integrate agri-food into health. So how do we go from this rigorous approach, Stats Canada, the Canadian Community Health Survey with rigorous methodology and similar rigorous methodologies in nutrigenomics, to exploring how we might see a connection between food and health? Can we apply a more rigorous metric to be able to approach this as opposed to nice shaking hands? How do we set the bar so we actually dissect that really important piece from knowledge generation, whether it's in population public health or in the omics era, to a more rigorous uptake of that knowledge, as opposed to just exploring it? It sounds pretty soft to me.
I don't know which way. I'm in the middle here, so I'm not sure how far I can reach. And I don't want to speak for Health Canada, but I did work there many years ago, and I think Harvey says explore, and often that exploration is pointing out to them that science is out there. And often they're very much aware of it. They read the literature the same as any other scientist. There are lots of scientists that work there. And so I think what it is their scientists and their staff are aware of things, and it's sort of taking it from what would be the scientific public policy type staff and making sure that it gets into what I would call more the political system, which when groups are in with the minister's office, I mean, you have to talk language that a minister would respond to our senior staff, but you still have to do it based on facts. And so that science has to be out there. It has to be published. You have to be able to say this is a peer review, a good study funded by CIHR in Canada, and this is what the data is showing. So therefore, minister or wherever you're speaking to, saying, therefore, this is good science, and as you're doing whatever policy they're doing, you need to take this into account. So I think it doesn't in any way diminish the importance of actually having really good, science, and we all know the metrics of good science, and then framing it when you have those discussions saying, this really good science is out here, as Harvey had, this is American data. We're not talking about that situation in Canada. This is the Canadian data, and therefore, because of this Canadian data, this is, the policy issue that needs to be addressed, and I think they're going to respond to it the same as anyone else, and often their officials are very much aware of that information. It's how do you translate that into language that someone more at a political or a generalist and staff members in those offices understand, and that's where we have to learn as scientists how to take really good science and translate and say our message into language that is more broadly understood.
Are there evolving methodologies in that space that we need to explore? Because, David, you showed that thing. These are all the recommendations. We give all the recommendations, and if you tailor it, that works. We know that in knowledge translation, tailoring the message works, but there's a lot of messages that don't go anywhere, and I wonder if a group of professionals across vast area of practice need to be clever and come up with new methodologies to try and address the issue.
Yeah, I didn't finish up very clearly on that. I mean, we have examples of, this whole of society change, as Lorette has identified. Finland had very high blood cholesterol levels, I guess it was 1978, big problems with cardiovascular disease. They had just changed. I was lucky enough to review the science programs for them a couple of times, a number of medical schools, and they restructured the whole system into taking pride in the Finnish diet. Valio, a big dairy company, broke out in a sweat, but they came out just fine. I mean, it's sort of like what Catherine was talking about. There's room for everybody, and you can succeed in that context of making use of. So they went more to the encouraging, the berries, just other industries. Their main meal then shifted to the middle of the day and subsidized, and the nice dark breads, everything that they just changed the eating patterns, and they spend less in hospitals. They have less childhood obesity. So that there are many whole of society ways to approach it. Whether that will work for us or not, I don't know. But we were cautious about how to go work with getting this kind of external playground outside the silos of health and agriculture, where we can talk. Maybe bring in some people that have had the experience. Arnie Ostrup, I think of, for example, who's been both Dean of Agriculture as well as medicine and heavily involved in the medical side. I think there are examples. So we do hope to move forward with some concrete steps and not just, the general remarks I made. I don't know, the crystal ball isn't very good right now, but I'm optimistic, and I'm always optimistic. So.
We'll take a question at the podium, Benoit.
Yeah, thank you. This was really interesting workshop. Congratulations to everyone and for their presentations. I guess a couple of comments or observations. Again, thinking about the Canadian diet or the renovation of the food guide, if we might call that. One risk we're running into is for people to perceive we're reinventing the wheel and trying to say, well, this is a new way to look at how we eat and a better way for better health. But at the end of the day, whether you call it DASH or Mediterranean diet or Canadian diet or actually Canadian food guide, it's very similar. And we give I think we give the perception to the population that we're always trying to reinvent the wheel, and we're actually not. And this is my first comment. Actually, we did an analysis just for the heck of it. You know, we scored the current food guide, Canadian food guide, according to the Mediterranean score. And on a range of 0 to 44, it ranked at 37. It's pretty high. And the mean score in Quebec is 20 on the scale of 0 to 44. So if you eat the Canadian food guide, you're close to the Mediterranean diet. So we give the perception that we're reinventing the definition of how we should eat, and I think that's partially causing some of the disruption and misconception about healthy eating. I guess now a question, and maybe you want to react on this after, but in all the surveys that we see about the consumer, I'd be curious, and maybe Isabelle from Nielsen, you have an answer on this, but do we ask people, because they say, well, the main influence for me to eat better is my family, is the web, is the whatever. Do we ask them how the environment influences them in making good food choices? Because at the end of the day, if we don't change the food supply and the way it's presented to the people, it's going to be really hard to have them adhere to a healthy dietary pattern. So do they say this is for them an influence, the food supply? Do we have any data on this?
I can't really answer the food supply question, but I can really tell you that, in my opinion, and what I've seen in reports that we've done at Nielsen, we give consumers sometimes very little credit. I think that they are actually more informed than we think they are. And yes, as I said in my presentation, there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of different sources and sometimes mixed messages, and it can get confusing and overwhelming. But consumers are getting more used to a couple of things. First, do more research on their own so they know a lot more than we think they do. And second, they're getting used to or getting better at knowing what's best for them. So when we're talking about the genetics and that type of thing, maybe we're not all at that level, but I think that we're increasing our awareness of what works for us and what doesn't work for us, whether it be by influencing health practitioners or family and friends, or whatever it is. But I think that we're learning to be more in tune with our own bodies, and we're learning to discern those things that might work for us and might not work for our family. So I think that listening to consumers actually will put the food industry ahead of the game.
Maybe I could just ask if Kathy or David has a comment that they want to provide, and perhaps on Benoit's first comment about reinventing the wheel. Do you have a comment to say on that, Catherine?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Benoit. I have a colleague who works in the marketing of health messages, and she talks a lot about how much noise there is in the system and how maybe we need to be more like Coca-Cola to get our message out there, that's something that really crystallizes with people and is succinct, and maybe it's eat your vegetables and exercise, and we don't need to worry about all of the rest of the complex nutritional messaging that's out there. So maybe what we need, instead of us sort of academic guys, is Coca-Cola's marketing division, and they could sort it out for us, and then we would have a message we could live with for the next 30 years.
Yes, I can help with that.
David, a perspective? Or?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that, to the point that we discussed a bit earlier, adding in this genetic information from an academic perspective, from a research perspective, is fantastic. It adds a layer of understanding to differential responses. But at the end of the day, we're just clouding the situation for the average consumer. The more information we give them, the more variables they have to juggle. And genetics is just one component. I alluded to the microbiome as the next big thing that's coming down the pipeline from a personalized perspective. That's going to be another layer of complication. So I agree that, in some ways the messages out there have to be simplified. The science can be elaborate, but the messages have to be simplified.
Yeah, I was just going to actually echo what David just said, because I think what even when we're looking at the food guide patterns, I mean, or the food eating patterns of Canadians, and I think as scientists we can slice and dice the same pie, cook it in 6 pieces or 8 pieces, but in the end it's still the apple pie. And I mean, what we're doing in a lot of these diet patterns is we're looking at different components of it, but as I showed earlier, those components, many of them are the same thing, they're just expressed different ways, and so, and they reflect that people can choose a lot of, you can choose all kinds of different vegetables and still count it as vegetables, all kinds of different, options. And so we're trying to make a single, one size fits all, but people have a huge, vast array of foods to choose from. And so we want to give them that direction of how to make those healthy choices, but not to be so prescriptive, because there's many ways of getting to that same healthy diet choices. And we can call it a Mediterranean diet, we can call it Canadian diet, we can call it DASH diet, but I think where the challenge that I think Health Canada have with the food guide is how do you take all those patterns and boil it down to what are the key messages that are going to help guide Canadians to make healthy food choices, which are integrating the information that we found from many sets of information. So the last thing we want is to make it, 10, 20 different messages. Any marketer will tell you that's doomed to failure before you start.
Thanks. Question at the microphone. Thank you for your patience.
Finally, I may not have a question. My name is Sylvie Saint-Pierre from Health Canada. Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed the morning. I was going to ask, but I think you basically answered that. What would be the one advice you would give to policy developers in terms of revamping the food guide? And some of you have already answered based on your knowledge and considering the food system. So I don't know if others wants to add, but thank you for your answers.
I'll start. I'll be things. I think I'd actually look at something like there's a couple of ways to do it, and I think when I looked at, because we presented about 4 different types of looking at patterns, and I think what are the common elements we're seeing? Fruit and vegetables are coming up. Whole grains are coming up on the positive sides, and on the other, if you want to say the negative side, because there's a lot of actually research with consumer research saying that there's a certain role that negative marketing is actually quite powerful if you make it something that's actionable. It has to be powerful and actionable. The two ones that come up on the other end is maybe eat out less often and watch, your either carbonated beverages and your snacks. So you can put them together, your salty snacks. So right there, that's only 4 or 5 messages. So you've boiled all those things. Those are common elements in all the food guides, and I think, and all those dietary patterns. And I think that's, if I were to pick those are common in whatever pattern that we looked at.
Yeah.
Other comments?
Yeah, maybe I should let Dr. Jenkins ask his question first, but, since we're talking about food guides, food patterns, I mean, when we're talking about the integration of the agri-food system, I want to get outside that trap and think about, the development in the future. But also, Dr. Gramlich's point in sitting beside her, one of the things, and I didn't mean to pick too much on medicine, but we don't do that good job of teaching nutrition in the medical school, and we don't do a good job of that knowledge translation into medicine and medical practice. And I was disappointed to see that all the answers to what needed to be done for research is all just secondary analysis and behavior analysis and stuff, rather than the primary discovery of effects of how food and nutrients affect the system when we have 60%, 70% that aren't normal, if you will, in this society. We need more of that experimental work to backbone and get the medical interest. And, we're not talking about the impact of the family physician, the whole system, as being a tremendous influencer on the health of Canadians, and especially with the dietary advice that could be given. So Leah needs more of that knowledge transfer kind of information. So there's different kinds of knowledge transfer information that we need. We're thinking about the consumer, but the consumer consumes from very different people. Anyway.
I think I'll allow Dr. Jenkins to
Thank you.
ask a question.
Just a quick one for Harv. Is there a Canadian diet? Should there be a Canadian diet? I mean, we heard Benoit talking about the the commonalities of the Mediterranean diet. Mary talks about the dash and the Mediterranean and the whatever all being the same. Is it time that we really started thinking of a more common diet for Homo sapiens and the sort of guiding principles? Because I think we agreed that there are only a few guiding principles that we can put out to the general public. So it's almost like a religion where the priests know the details that the scientists are, and the general public get an overall message. Perhaps that's wrong. I'm sorry if I've offended anyone. But I think that, and with our population now zooming towards 11 billion, I think we may have to think fairly quickly about what the commonalities are that we need for Homo sapiens on this planet.
Somebody like to address that point?
I agree with Dr. Jenkins.
There we go. And with that, I think that will draw this session to a close, unless any of the panelists have a final comment they'd like to make at this point in time. If not, would you please join me in thanking the panel for a fantastic discussion. We have 2 more speakers this afternoon.